The air hung thick with the stench of burnt cordite and the acrid tang of defeat. A pall cast not only over the ravaged landscape of the Third Reich, but also upon the spirits of its weary soldiers. The Allied juggernaut, a relentless tide of steel and resolve, pressed ever inward, grinding against the remnants of the once vaunted German war machine. To speak of the Wehrmacht in those final weeks, the twilight of the conflict, was to conjure an image of tattered uniforms, depleted ranks, and a desperate, almost futile resistance. This depiction, though bleak, was not entirely inaccurate. On the Western Front particularly, the unrelenting pressure of containing the eastern advance had bled the defending forces dry. The elite units, the prized panzers, the most seasoned officers, all were channeled east, a desperate attempt to stem the red tide. What remained to face the American, British, Canadian and French armies was a patchwork force, ill-equipped and desperately short on experienced leadership. The Ardennes offensive, a gamble of epic proportions, had squandered much of the last of the Western Army's advanced armaments. The new Volksgrenadier divisions, hastily assembled and lacking the hardened veterans of previous campaigns, paid a brutal price in blood for their inexperience. The strategic blunder of refusing Army Group B permission to retreat across the Rhine, a decision born of arrogance and delusion, sealed the fate of hundreds of thousands of men. The Ruhr pocket became a tomb for over 300,000 of Germany's soldiers, a crippling blow that shattered organised resistance on the Western Front. Allied forces then surged across the German landscape with greater ease, a momentum that drove them towards Berlin, the shattered heart of the collapsing empire. Yet, even in these dire circumstances, in the shadow of inevitable defeat, pockets of resistance flickered like dying embers. The following account demonstrates that, even in the final throes of the war, the German military, even at its weakest, retained the capacity to inflict pain, to execute tactical manoeuvres that defied their overall strategic disadvantage. Allied commanders, emboldened by their advances, were soon to learn that the German soldier, fighting on home soil, possessed a tenacity, a desperate ferocity that could turn complacency into a costly lesson. One such lesson was delivered by the Scharnhorst Infantry Division, a unit forged in the crucible of desperation, an organisation of men thrown together at the very edge of the abyss. Activated on March 30th, 1945, it was an amalgamation of shattered remnants. Fragments of the 340th and 167th Volksgrenadier divisions, battle-scarred and depleted, were fused with the 412th Volks Artillery Corps. However, the division's infantry companies were far from typical. They were largely composed of officer cadets from Military District 11, young men thrust into the inferno of combat before their training was complete, supplemented by surplus Luftwaffe personnel, veterans pulled from the airfields and thrown into the trenches. Among these airmen were experienced soldiers, adorned with hard-earned decorations, a grim testament to the many battles they had survived. Further augmenting the ranks was the Fusilier Company, the remaining members of the exhausted Potem Infantry Division. This mixed force was moulded into the blueprint of a 1945 infantry division, a desperate attempt to compensate for dwindling manpower with concentrated firepower, a final evolution, if one could call it that, of the Volksgrenadier concept. The Scharnhorst Division, a force totalling less than 6,000 men, was composed of 3 grenadier regiments, the core of its fighting strength. Atypical for any army, approximately 80% of these grenadiers were officer cadets, aspiring non-commissioned officers, and other trainees, all led by instructors from various training schools. The designation officer cadet was misleading, painting a portrait of inexperienced youth. While many were indeed teenagers, 17 or 18 years old, freshly plucked from their classrooms, a significant number were seasoned veterans, soldiers who had proven themselves in the brutal crucible of the Eastern Front. These veterans had been selected for officer training, a reward for their valour and experience, and now found themselves leading raw recruits into a desperate battle for survival. Furthermore, the instructors themselves were grizzled veterans, officers and NCOs adorned with medals, their chests a canvas of past battles and triumphs, their knowledge of combat honed through years of hard-fought experience. They possessed the knowledge to command, to adapt, and to instill discipline, even within the chaos of a collapsing army. Such experienced leadership, coupled with the raw determination of the young cadets, ensured that even soldiers with minimal training were moulded into effective fighting men, soldiers driven by a desire to perform well, to prove their worth in the face of overwhelming odds. The grenadier regiments, considering the circumstances, were relatively well equipped, especially in small arms and handheld anti-tank weaponry. The standard weapon was the Mauser K 98K bolt-action rifle, a relic of an older era, yet reliable and deadly in the hands of a skilled marksman. However, at least one company in each battalion was armed with the innovative STG-44 assault rifle, a weapon that offered a significant increase in firepower. MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns provided a withering curtain of fire, and the men carried a plentiful supply of Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck anti-tank weapons, a desperate defence against the Allied armour that roamed the battlefield. Each battalion was also equipped with mortars, and a scattering of anti-tank guns was distributed among the regiments. Armoured support, though crucial, was a luxury in those final days. The scarcity of vehicles and the crippling shortage of fuel presented an insurmountable challenge. The Scharnhorst Division was assigned a Panzerjägerabteilung, a tank hunting unit consisting of 7 Hetzer tank destroyers. These nimble, low-profile vehicles, armed with powerful guns, were a valuable asset in the defence, capable of ambushing enemy armour. Despite this support, the division's organic armoured strength was minimal, and its artillery support was woefully inadequate. The US forces pressed relentlessly towards the Elbe River, the last significant natural barrier standing between them and Berlin. On April 12, 1945, the Scharnhorst Division, under the orders of the German 12th Army, was tasked with occupying defensive positions in the vicinity of the town of Barbie, situated midway between Magdeburg and Dessau, on the western bank of the Elbe. On April 11th, before assuming its defensive posture, the division received reinforcements. A welcome addition came in the form of Abteilung 1170, a unit equipped with 19 Stugs, Sturmgeschütz, and 12 Styr assault guns. As the US forces prepared to breach the Elbe at 3 strategic points in the area, the German 12th Army deployed the Scharnhorst and Ulrich von Hutten infantry divisions to defend the bridgehead on the west bank of the Elbe near Dessau. A 3rd division was positioned on the east bank north of Magdeburg, reinforced by local Volkssturm Home Guard battalions. Meanwhile, to the south of Magdeburg, the US 2nd Armoured Division had established a small bridgehead on the east bank of the Elbe. This bridgehead now became the focal point of General Walter Wenck, commander of the German 12th Army, who issued orders to General Lieutenant Hinrich Gutzmann, commander of the Scharnhorst Division, to eliminate it before dawn on April 13, 1945. A battalion from the US 30th Division's 119th Infantry Regiment reinforced the beleaguered bridgehead, bringing the total number of US troops to 3 battalions. Engineers, however, were struggling to complete a treadway bridge, which would allow tanks, tank destroyers, and anti-tank guns to cross to the east side of the river. This left the US forces vulnerable, exposed, and ripe for a counterattack. The crossing point was constantly under intermittent German shell fire. At first light, the German barrage intensified dramatically, utilising the large-caliber guns from the Luftwaffe flak batteries guarding Magdeburg. US artillery responded in kind, unleashing its own barrage. Smoke screens were deployed, but to little avail. The Americans desperately called for fighter bomber support, but their requests went unanswered. The US advance had been so rapid, so relentless, that they had outstripped their air cover, leaving the front lines exposed and unsupported. By the afternoon, US engineers had managed to construct a treadway pontoon bridge to within 25 yards of the eastern shore. Just as success seemed within reach, German shells rained down, obliterating their progress and destroying the bridge. Major General White, commander of the 2nd Armored Division, reluctantly ordered the bridgehead abandoned. The focus of the American effort then shifted 3 miles upstream to the site of a bridge already destroyed by the Germans at Schönebeck. 3 US infantry battalions moved into position, and by the morning of April 14th, Company L of the 119th Infantry Regiment, along with elements of a battalion from the 41st Armoured Infantry Regiment, had advanced 2 miles beyond the Elbe, seizing the town of Elbenau. Simultaneously, another armoured infantry regiment unit had driven approximately 250 German soldiers from the riverside village of Grunau. While the Americans busily dug in around the perimeter of the newly established bridgehead, and engineers commenced bridging operations, the Scharnhorst Division prepared to strike. 1 grenadier battalion, supplemented by assault guns and a handful of Panther tanks, received orders to assault the US bridgehead. The German attack commenced at dawn, catching the Americans off guard. Though outnumbered 3-1, the Germans initiated their assault, regardless of conventional military doctrine where attacking forces typically outnumbered the enemy. Undeterred, the Germans prepared for a bold attack. The German force, designated KG Gruppe Ringelheim, moved out with deadly intent. The initial blow landed on 3rd Battalion, 119th Infantry, followed moments later by 3rd Battalion, 41st Armoured Infantry Regiment. Company Y of the 119th Infantry reported German tanks approaching from its right. Lacking bazookas, the unit was helpless to stop them. Simultaneously, Company L reported 6 German tanks or tank destroyers, 2 20mm flak cannons, and approximately a battalion of German infantry attacking from the east and northeast. The 1st platoon of Company L, positioned on the extreme eastern edge of Elbenau, engaged the German column. The German armour and infantry, however, swiftly manoeuvred to attack them from the north, overwhelming Company L in the process. The US battalion commander ordered his remaining companies to fall back to Company K's positions, located in the woods south of the town. The order was late. Many of the men went to ground inside the town, and Company L was cut off. Company I was fragmented. German armour was observed and engaged, notably by US artillery on the opposite bank, but its fire was sporadic and ineffective as the German tanks continued to advance. Meanwhile, 2nd Armoured Division headquarters promised reinforcements. The 2nd German attack struck the 3rd Battalion, 41st Armoured Infantry Regiment, at Grunau shortly after the assault on Elbenau. The attack was well coordinated, indicating the influence of the experienced training instructors in command of the German force. The German armour, bypassing the 119th Infantry's positions, crashed into the 41st Armoured Infantry Regiment's positions, scattering the US platoons. At 5 a.m, Company I was assaulted by 3 Panther tanks with accompanying infantry. The Americans held their fire until the German force was within 150 yards of their foxholes, then unleashed a barrage. The bazooka rounds bounced harmlessly off the armour of the advancing Panthers. The Scharnhorst Division employed a ruthless tactic, violating the laws of war. In certain areas, they placed captured Americans in front of the armour and infantry, forcing them towards the US positions at gunpoint. German tank guns and machine guns fired through the ranks of the US prisoners, and the Americans could not effectively return fire for fear of hitting their own men. The US forces fell back towards the river, 1 platoon providing covering fire for the next. Company G was overrun, with the survivors fleeing past the battalion command post. They fought hard, but their positions were destroyed 1 foxhole at a time until the survivors reached the river. Communications between the battalions, companies and platoons in the bridgehead had disintegrated. The order came from Combat Command B, 2nd Armoured Division, to evacuate the bridgehead. Everyone was ordered to fall back to Grunau, establish a perimeter defence and hold it. By 11:30 a.m, the 3rd Battalion, 41st Armoured Infantry Regiment, had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Only isolated groups remained. Engineers worked feverishly to repair the damaged ferry cable and ramp, but German artillery fire severed the cable. Tanks and more infantry were needed to hold the bridgehead, but the decision was made to evacuate using DUKWs, amphibious trucks. The US perimeter at Grunau collapsed as the companies evacuated under the protective fire of American tanks and tank destroyers on the west bank of the Elbe. Everyone who could be evacuated was taken out by 4 p.m. Some GIs managed to cross the river after dark. The casualty toll was heavy. Many Americans were listed as killed or missing, many of the latter dead. The majority of US losses were men taken prisoner, both wounded and unwounded. 10 vehicles were lost. The Germans, according to official US Army estimates, captured over 300 GYs. For the Scharnhorst Division, the destruction of the US bridgehead represented a significant victory. It demonstrated that even in the last weeks of the war, ad hoc German divisions could deliver a bloody nose to the enemy. In this instance, the scarcity of US anti-tank weapons and armour within the bridgehead enabled the skillfully commanded German tanks and infantry to overwhelm an enemy force 3 times its size. The battle